Okay, so this video lecture is covering the first chapter in our book, Ethics, the Basics, by John Mazzoni, and I'm going to basically outline what is outlined in that chapter and talking about what are the fundamental parts about ethics and the questions and the things we discuss when we're talking about ethics generally. So first off, what is ethics? And ethics is a couple of things. It's kind of a historical study of the decisions people have made and why. So looking back and trying to understand what are the many influences which affect how people make decisions, cultures, regions of the world, politics, all those things. Ethics is a part of that. And then the second one is more personal and also applicable to us moving forward, and that is, what should we do? It's a philosophy of trying to understand should we do this, how we make decisions. The philosophical problems, 4 of them which are outlined in this chapter. First, the origin of ethics. So where does this desire to find out what we should do come from? Second is relativism. We'll go into more in detail about that. But essentially that can what we should do be relative to a person's situation. Human nature, are there things which are part of being human, which then dictate what we think ethically and how we make decisions? And conduct, then what are the things, again, like we said before, what should we do? The attempts to connect principles and framework for an understanding of ethical problems are ethical theories. So when we are trying to kind of systemize ethics, that's when we can categorize or generalize certain principles to form then an ethic or an ethical theory. So some of them are even grouped beyond that. So we have consequential ethical theories such as egoism and utilitarianism, and so on and so forth. So we will go through these ethical theories, different ones, in our course. Ethical traditions, on the other hand, these are things which are passed from generation to generation, or culturally or geographically or whatever, that are just what people have done and will always do, often without question. And so generally there's not necessarily a theory behind it. It's just what people have done. Oftentimes religions have a religious tradition, and those traditions are passed and oftentimes unquestioned. Some of the times they are questioned, of course, but then you would be trying to understand more about what's the theory rather than just accepting the tradition. All right, so relative ethics is an idea that individuals and what they should do, cultures and what they should do, is relative to their situation or person's circumstance. And so some of the things which affect relative ethics include culture, society, and those traditions that we talked about before. Ethical relativism is the view that all ethical decisions are relative, that we cannot subscribe one set of rules to a different circumstance. Everything must be taken in context. Cultural relativism is not an ethical tradition. This is just saying that cultures have different practices, standards, and values. So acknowledging that cultures do have different ethics, and that's a study of thought which some ethicists will look into, but that's different than ethical relativism, which is more of a school of thought. Universal ethics then would be the opposite, saying that there are at least some principles, and this is a little easier to do, whereas relative ethics said everything is relative. Universal ethics is saying at least some things are universal, no matter what tradition you belong to. And some examples of that might include the golden rule, monotheism, having one God, a common human nature, that humans are able to be rational and reason. And so this is opposed to then our relative ethics thought. All right, to kind of illustrate some of the contradictions between these, the book and I wanted to briefly talk about tolerance. So if you're going to say that relativism implies that everyone has to be tolerant of different cultures and make exceptions and allow for different cultures to have different decisions, and thus you can't tell different cultures what to do, essentially. This would be a universal ideology. So if you're saying everyone has to tolerate because of relativism, there you created a conundrum. Is this then universal or relative? And then on the flip side, what if a culture has a cultural practice of being intolerant, that that's part of their culture? Then relativism would say you have to allow them to be intolerant, but at the same time, relativism would imply that you have to tolerate that. And so there's a contradiction there. So a question that also highlights this is it a universal human right to have relative ethics? So this is asking then a universalistic principle to apply to something relative. And so you come up with contradictions when you try and make a universal acceptance of a relative thought. Okay, that's it.